It's strange how a life you once thought was perfect can slowly unravel without you even noticing. That's how it felt for me in my marriage. Like a favorite sweater slowly coming apart at the seams, bit by bit, until all that's left is a tangle of threads you're desperately trying to pull together. I had married Daniel nearly a decade ago. And back then, I thought he was everything I'd ever want: steady, dependable, and endlessly kind. But now, years later, dependable was starting to feel more like distant, and kindness had morphed into something closer to routine politeness. Over time, our life had become predictable, worn down by the weight of schedules, bills, and career ambitions. Daniel had been getting more ambitious with his work, taking on more projects, traveling frequently for business, and climbing the ladder with a determined focus. I used to admire his drive, the way he'd take on a challenge and pour himself into it until he'd conquered it. But now, every time he walked out the door, suit pressed, bag slung over his shoulder, I felt an ache in my chest. It was as if he was leaving a part of himself behind, but it wasn't me he left that part with. It was his career, his endless meetings, and his tireless drive to succeed. Home had become a quiet, almost solemn place, filled with nights of takeout containers and the soft hum of the TV as I tried to occupy myself with the latest series or lose myself in a novel. I remember lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, thinking, is this it? Is this really what my life is going to be? On the weekends, Daniel and I would see our friends, always in groups, always with his colleagues or their spouses. We'd play our parts, laughing and talking, yet somehow never connecting. It was at one of these gatherings that I felt the first tiny ripple of change, though at the time, I didn't understand it. It was a Saturday night at our friend Megan's house, a small get-together filled with laughter, wine, and the comforting lull of familiar faces. Daniel had left early, citing an early flight for another business trip the next day, leaving me to mingle and enjoy the evening on my own. And that's when I saw him, Adam, Daniel's best friend from college. Adam was tall, with an easygoing charm and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We'd known each other for years, shared countless conversations over dinners and drinks, but until that night, I'd never really noticed him. Not in that way. He was just Daniel's friend, someone who was always around, like part of the scenery. But that night, as he moved through the room, joking with everyone, his laughter catching on the edges of the conversation, I felt something unexpected, a pang of admiration, maybe even a flicker of attraction. I quickly brushed it off, reminding myself that he was just a friend, and I was married. Yet, something had shifted, even if I didn't want to admit it. As the night wore on, I lost track of time, engrossed in conversation and a few glasses of wine. When I glanced at the clock, it was already past midnight. Most people had left, and I found myself in the doorway saying my goodbyes when Adam walked over. "Leaving without a ride?" he asked, a playful grin on his face. "I don't think the buses are running this late." "Oh, I was planning to just grab an Uber," I replied, shrugging it off as if I did this sort of thing all the time. The truth was, the thought of sitting alone in a car with a stranger at this hour made me a little uneasy. "Nonsense," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "I'll take you home. It's on my way, anyway." I hesitated. It wasn't as though Adam was a stranger. He'd been over to our house countless times, and we'd shared endless conversations. But something about being alone with him felt different now, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Still, it seemed silly to decline. "All right," I agreed, smiling as I let him lead the way to his car. As I settled into the passenger seat, I felt a strange flutter in my stomach, a faint, unfamiliar sense of anticipation. We'd always had good conversations, but that night, as we drove, it felt deeper, more intentional. Adam asked how things were going, not in the casual way most people do, but with genuine curiosity. I found myself opening up about Daniel's constant traveling, the long, empty nights, and the way I sometimes felt invisible. "Daniel's lucky, you know," Adam said softly, glancing over at me. "Not every woman would be so understanding about all those late nights and business trips." I laughed, though it was tinged with a hint of bitterness. "Well, maybe I'm just used to it by now." I don't think he even realizes how much he's gone. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I instantly regretted them. I didn't want to be that person, the one who complained about her husband. But Adam just nodded, his expression gentle and understanding. As the city lights flickered by outside the window, I felt a warmth growing between us, an unspoken connection that both comforted and unsettled me. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but there was something there, something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of being seen, understood. We were almost at my house when Adam pulled over for a moment, mentioning something about a small mechanical issue with his car. He stepped out to check, leaving me alone in the quiet stillness of the night. I watched him through the windshield, the way he moved with a casual confidence. And for a moment, I felt like I was in someone else's life, a life where my heart didn't feel as heavy. When he climbed back into the car, he smiled apologetically. "Sorry about that. This car's got a mind of its own sometimes." I shrugged, smiling back. "No problem. It's nice to have the company." He glanced at me, his eyes lingering just a bit too long. "Anytime, really." The words hung in the air between us, and for a heartbeat, I felt something shift, something fragile and thrilling, like the first breath of spring after a long, cold winter. I told myself it was nothing, just the remnants of an unexpectedly nice evening with a friend. But as I stepped out of the car and waved goodbye, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Inside my quiet, dark house, I slipped off my shoes and wandered into the bedroom. The emptiness seemed more palpable than usual, the silence almost heavy. I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the night in my mind, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking it. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of Adam's gentle smile and warm gaze stayed with me, like a whisper in the back of my mind. As I lay down, pulling the covers up to my chin, I realized something unsettling. I was looking forward to seeing him again. The next day dawned in a way that felt both routine and slightly altered. The morning light streaming through the window seemed brighter, sharper somehow, as if it knew something had shifted. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the remnants of last night's wine and the bittersweet memory of my conversation with Adam. By the time I was dressed and moving through my usual routine, making coffee, checking emails, tidying up the kitchen, I had convinced myself it was just another ordinary day. Daniel's text arrived mid-morning, made it safe to Houston. Meetings all day. Won't have much time to call, but will text when I can. That was the rhythm we had fallen into. Short, informative messages, more like business updates than actual conversations. I tapped out a quick reply, "Great. Be safe. Let me know if you need anything." It was just another part of our routine, messages that felt more like duty than connection. I spent the rest of the day busying myself with small tasks. Things I'd usually leave for the weekend: organizing drawers, going through old photo albums, even dusting shelves. It kept my mind off the nagging emptiness that had begun to feel almost normal, a kind of quiet resignation. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I just felt unfulfilled, as though I was living in the shadow of something richer, something more vibrant. By late afternoon, I needed to get out of the house. The walls felt too close, and the silence too loud. I decided on a quick trip to the grocery store, hoping the change of scenery might help clear my mind. It was a small neighborhood market, the kind where you always see someone you know. The place was buzzing with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional laughter of children running down aisles, their parents chasing after them with exasperated smiles. I was standing in the produce section, weighing apples in my hand, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Well, fancy running into you here." I turned, and there he was, Adam, looking as surprised as I felt. He had a basket in his hand, filled with what looked like the basics: milk, bread, some fresh vegetables. He smiled, his expression warm and easy, and I felt that same flutter in my stomach, the one I'd convinced myself was just a fluke the night before. "Hey, Adam," I managed, hoping my voice sounded casual. "What brings you here?" He shrugged, glancing down at his basket. "Just grabbing a few things for dinner. I'd invite you over, but it looks like you're stocked up yourself." His eyes twinkled with a playful glint, and I couldn't help but smile. Just the essentials, I replied, holding up the apples. Nothing fancy. Well, even essentials can be made into something special, he said, and his voice took on a tone that felt intimate, somehow. It was the kind of comment Daniel might have made once, back when we still flirted, when we still found reasons to linger in each other's presence. I felt myself blush, caught off guard by how easily Adam made me feel seen. We stood there for a moment, the sounds of the market fading into the background as we locked eyes. It was only a second, but it felt like longer, as if time had paused just for us. Then, as if sensing the tension, he broke eye contact, glancing down at his basket with a sheepish grin. "So, how was last night after I left?" he asked, changing the subject with a smoothness that made me both grateful and a little disappointed. "Quiet," I replied, shrugging. "Most people left soon after you did. I was home before I knew it." He nodded, and for a moment, his expression softened, as if he understood exactly what I meant. There was a warmth in his eyes, a kind of empathy that felt rare, and it made me want to keep talking, to keep the moment from ending. Without thinking, I found myself inviting him to grab a coffee. "I mean, we're both here," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "There's a cafe around the corner. Would you want to?" His smile widened, genuine and warm. "Yeah," he replied, almost too quickly. "I'd love that." A few minutes later, we were sitting across from each other in a cozy corner of the cafe, the sound of steam hissing from the espresso machine and the gentle murmur of voices creating a comfortable backdrop. I cradled my coffee cup in my hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers as I tried to shake off the nervous energy buzzing inside me. We talked about everything and nothing: work, memories from college, mutual friends. The conversation flowed easily, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. I told him about the classes I'd been taking in photography, a hobby I'd picked up recently to fill the long, empty evenings. He listened intently, asking questions, making me feel as though my small pursuits were something remarkable. "Photography, huh?" he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I had no idea you were interested in that. I'd love to see your work sometime." His words struck me more deeply than I'd expected. Daniel had never shown much interest in my hobbies, brushing them off as little distractions. But Adam's attention felt different, genuine. I felt a swell of pride mixed with a confusing sense of vulnerability. "I'm not that good yet," I admitted, looking down, suddenly shy. "Just experimenting. But maybe sometime if you're interested." "I am," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "I'd love to." There was a pause, and in that quiet moment, the weight of his words hung between us, carrying a depth that felt both thrilling and dangerous. I found myself wondering what he was thinking, if he felt this strange pull between us, too. Part of me wanted to ask, to take the conversation somewhere deeper, but fear held me back. I wasn't sure I was ready to open that door, to admit that there was something here, something neither of us had acknowledged out loud. Finally, I broke the silence, changing the subject to something lighter, safer. We spent another hour talking, laughing over shared memories, and for a while, I forgot about the ticking clock, about the fact that I had a husband waiting for me at home. Adam made me feel like someone I hadn't been in a long time, lighthearted, carefree, and alive. When we eventually stood to leave, the sky had turned a soft shade of pink and gold, the first hints of sunset casting a warm glow over the street. We walked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing, and each touch sent a small thrill through me. I knew it was dangerous, this feeling, but in that moment, I didn't care. I was just happy to be there, in his presence, feeling like someone I thought I'd lost. As we reached the spot where our cars were parked, Adam turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "I really enjoyed this, he said, his voice low and sincere. "We should do it again sometime." I nodded, feeling the warmth of his gaze settle over me. Me too. It was nice. "Thank you." He smiled, and for a second, I thought he might reach out, touch my hand, but he stopped himself, shoving his hands into his pockets instead. "Anytime," he replied, his tone soft, almost wistful. I watched him walk away, his figure silhouetted against the fading light, and a wave of emotions washed over me: gratitude, confusion, longing. I knew I shouldn't be feeling this way, that this was dangerous territory, but I couldn't help it. Being with Adam felt like rediscovering a part of myself I thought I'd buried, a part that longed to be seen, to be wanted. As I drove home, the streets blurred in a soft haze, my mind replaying every moment of the afternoon. I tried to remind myself that it was nothing, that Adam was just a friend, and I was simply feeling nostalgic, lonely. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. This was something more, a spark that had been lit, one I wasn't sure I could put out. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a few extra minutes, gathering myself before heading inside. The house was as quiet and empty as always, the silence settling around me like a familiar weight. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: a flutter of excitement, a thrill that made my heart race. I wasn't sure what it meant or where it would lead, but in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I was looking forward to the next time I'd see Adam, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. It had been almost a week since that unexpected coffee with Adam, and I still couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying our conversation, the warmth of his gaze, the way he'd listened to me like I was the most fascinating person in the world. It felt silly to hold on to something as simple as a coffee date, but it had become a rare bright spot in my routine. Each evening, as I settled onto the couch with another novel or the latest mindless series, I'd find myself drifting back to that day. But life moved on as it always does. My days continued in their usual rhythm, Daniel busy with his work, and me filling my time with little tasks that, in truth, didn't fill the void I felt. I didn't see Adam, and I didn't reach out. After all, we both had our lives, and I didn't want to make anything complicated. It was late Thursday afternoon when I found myself back at the grocery store. My pantry was looking a bit sparse, and I decided a quick shopping trip would be a good distraction. I wandered through the aisles, selecting items almost absent-mindedly: a bag of rice, a carton of milk, a couple of avocados. I had nearly finished my list when I turned a corner and nearly collided with someone coming the other way. "Oh," I gasped, stepping back, and then I froze, recognizing the familiar face right in front of me. "Adam." "Oh wow, hey," he said, equally surprised, his expression shifting into a warm smile as he realized it was me. I felt an immediate rush of excitement, mixed with a faint sense of nervousness. "Hi, Adam," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Fancy seeing you here again." "Well, I like to keep my grocery shopping exciting." "Apparently it's working," he joked, and I couldn't help but laugh. He looked down at his basket, then back at me, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Are you stalking me?" he teased, his tone light but his eyes searching, as if he was reading into my reaction, seeing the flush that had undoubtedly crept into my cheeks. "Me? Stalking? Never," I replied, doing my best to sound playful despite my heart thudding a little too quickly. "Though maybe you're the one stalking me." He chuckled, and I noticed a slight hint of embarrassment, which made him look endearingly boyish. "Tooch. All right, I'll stop with the accusations." He held up a bag of pasta he'd just picked up. "I was going to make a big pasta dinner tonight. What about you? Anything special planned?" I glanced into my cart, feeling a little sheepish at my lackluster ingredients. "Not really," I admitted. "It's just me tonight, so I was thinking of something simple. Maybe a stir-fry." "Nothing wrong with a good stir-fry," he said, nodding approvingly. "But if you wanted, I'd be more than happy to cook for two. No pressure, of course, just an offer." His invitation hung in the air between us, and I felt that familiar warmth from our coffee date starting to build inside me. The idea of sharing a meal with him, of spending a little more time together, felt as appealing as it was dangerous. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep my boundaries clear, but another part, the part that had been feeling alone and unseen for so long, couldn't resist. "Well," I said slowly, pretending to think it over. Though my decision had already been made, "I suppose I could be convinced to join you, just as long as you promise to cook. I'm not that great with pasta." "Deal," he replied with a grin, looking genuinely pleased. Meet me in the pasta aisle in 5 minutes, and I'll give you a lesson in pasta making." I laughed, feeling a surge of excitement I hadn't felt in ages. "I'll be there." We parted briefly, and as I pushed my cart toward the pasta aisle, I couldn't shake the nervous thrill fluttering in my chest. This was harmless, I told myself. Just two friends cooking dinner together. But I knew deep down that it wasn't as innocent as I wanted it to be. When I found Adam again, he was holding a bottle of olive oil and a jar of sun-dried tomatoes, his expression thoughtful as he looked over a shelf of herbs. He glanced up when he saw me and smiled, holding up his ingredients. "We're going fancy tonight. You ready?" "As long as fancy doesn't involve burning anything," I joked, though in truth, I was already impressed by the little touches he'd chosen. "Don't worry, I've got it all under control," he assured me with a wink. "We'll keep it simple but delicious." After we'd gathered the last of the ingredients, we checked out together, chatting about the different ways we like to cook, our favorite meals, the best restaurants we'd tried. It felt so easy, so natural, like we'd known each other forever. The conversation was so engrossing that I hardly noticed the other shoppers giving us curious glances, as though they, too, could sense the spark between us. When we arrived at his place, Adam led me into his kitchen, a bright, modern space that was surprisingly well organized. He'd set out a couple of wine glasses, which he filled with a crisp white wine before handing me one. "To new recipes," he said, clinking his glass against mine. His eyes held mine as he took a sip, and I felt a little shiver run down my spine. "To new recipes," I echoed, feeling the warmth of the wine and his gaze settle over me. We began cooking, moving easily around each other in the kitchen, laughing as I tried to keep up with his instructions. He'd show me how to chop the garlic, how to toss the pasta in the pan, and each time he'd guide me, his hand would linger just a little too long on mine. Our laughter turned softer as we worked, our touches lingering just a bit too long, our gazes holding for a moment more than necessary. "Who knew you'd be such a natural at this?" he teased as I stirred the pasta, the aroma of garlic and tomatoes filling the kitchen. "Well, maybe I just needed the right teacher," I replied, looking up at him with a smile that felt both playful and meaningful. His gaze softened, and for a second, I thought he might close the space between us. But he only smiled back, his expression tender, almost protective. Dinner was ready before we knew it, and we carried our plates to his dining table, the food looking and smelling delicious. We ate slowly, savoring each bite, our conversation growing more personal with each passing minute. He told me about his job, his struggles, his dreams, and I found myself sharing things I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Daniel. I spoke about the loneliness I'd been feeling, the sense of restlessness that had been gnawing at me, and he listened with an understanding that felt like a balm to my soul. By the time we finished eating, the sun had set, and the room was bathed in a soft, golden light. We lingered at the table, our wine glasses in hand, the comfortable silence stretching between us. I felt a mixture of contentment and apprehension, knowing that this moment was precious but also fragile, teetering on the edge of something more. "Thank you," I said softly, breaking the silence. "For tonight, I didn't realize how much I needed this." He reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against mine. "I'm glad you came," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a while since I've felt this way, since I've connected with someone like this." The vulnerability in his words, the warmth in his touch, it all made my heart race, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else, about the life waiting for me outside of this moment, about the boundaries I was beginning to blur. In that instant, it was just us, two people sharing a rare, beautiful connection. I glanced down, unable to meet his gaze, my heart pounding as I tried to find the right words. "Adam, I don't know if this is." He gently squeezed my hand, his expression understanding. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "And I don't want to complicate things for you, but just know that I'm here, that I care." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, and I felt an overwhelming gratitude, mixed with a confusing sense of longing. I hadn't realized how much I'd been yearning for someone to simply be there, to truly see me, until this moment. I looked back up, meeting his gaze, and in that instant, I felt something shift between us, an unspoken promise, a connection that went beyond words. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. It was soft, quick, but filled with a tenderness that surprised even me. "Thank you, Adam," I whispered, pulling back, my heart still racing. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a warmth that made me feel both safe and exhilarated. "Anytime," he murmured, his voice soft and sincere. As I stood to leave, he walked me to the door, his hand resting lightly on my back, guiding me in a way that felt both comforting and intimate. I turned to him once more, our faces close, our eyes locking. Days passed since our shared dinner, each one feeling slightly less vivid, as if life had returned to a muted palette now that I wasn't spending time with Adam. I went about my daily routines as usual, burying myself in work and the occasional night out with friends. But every now and then, in those moments when the house fell silent, or when I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, I felt a pang, a small, persistent reminder of the spark I'd felt with him. I told myself it was just loneliness. After all, Daniel was still traveling as usual, and it wasn't like I was intentionally seeking out Adam. It was simply that spending time with him made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in ages. I hadn't texted or called him since that night, though the temptation grew with each passing day. I reasoned that reaching out first might suggest something I wasn't ready to confront. But then, as if the universe was making a decision on my behalf, I heard the familiar ping of a message notification while I was sitting in the cafe around the corner from my house. I looked down, and there it was, Adam's name on my screen. "Hey, was thinking about that pasta night. I had way too many leftovers and thought I'd see how you're doing. Let me know if you're up for a coffee sometime soon. My treat." I smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and excitement. His message was casual, friendly, and filled with the same warmth I'd come to associate with him. It wasn't just the offer for coffee, it was the way he phrased it. Like he was genuinely interested in my life and how I was feeling. I quickly typed out a reply, trying to keep it light. "Sounds good. I'm actually at Cafe Sol right now if you're free." Less than 10 minutes later, I spotted him walking through the door, his gaze scanning the room until he found me. His face lit up in a smile, and I felt the flutter in my stomach return, a small thrill I couldn't deny. "Hey, you," he greeted, sliding into the seat across from me. "I hope I'm not crashing your peaceful coffee time." "Not at all," I replied, grinning. "I was actually just about to message you back about how that pasta night was one of the best dinners I've had in a long time." He chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'll take that as a compliment. I aim to please." As we ordered our drinks, the conversation began to flow easily, like it always did with Adam. He asked about my week, his genuine curiosity making me feel seen and appreciated. I asked him about work, about how he'd been handling things lately, and he shrugged, explaining the usual challenges with a resigned grin. As we sipped our coffee, our conversation drifted into deeper territory. We began discussing our dreams, the things we'd hoped to accomplish, the versions of ourselves we thought we'd become by now. He shared stories from his past, moments of uncertainty and growth, and I found myself opening up about my own struggles, admitting to feelings I'd kept buried even from myself. Do you ever feel like I hesitated, the words feeling too vulnerable, too close to a part of myself I wasn't sure I wanted to expose? But he was looking at me with such kindness, such understanding, that I continued. Do you ever feel like you're just waiting? Like there's something you're supposed to do or feel, but you're not quite there? He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I get that. I think a lot of us are just going through the motions, hoping that one day everything will just fall into place. He paused, swirling his coffee absently. But then sometimes you have moments that shake you up, that make you question things, and you start wondering if maybe you're meant for something different. His words resonated with me, and for a brief moment, I felt a rush of emotion, a sense of being understood in a way I hadn't expected. The hum of the cafe around us faded as we sat there, both lost in thought. Do you think that's what this is? I asked softly, glancing at him. That maybe we're just shaking things up a bit? He met my gaze, and for a second, I saw something in his eyes, a flash of longing, a question unspoken. Maybe, he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Or maybe we're just finally allowing ourselves to feel things we've been holding back. The intensity of his words lingered between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I looked down, focusing on my coffee cup as I tried to process the emotions swirling within me. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out to bridge the gap between us and see where this connection could lead. But another part held me back, cautioning me against crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As if sensing my inner conflict, Adam changed the subject, his tone light and easy once more. So, any big plans for the weekend? I smiled, grateful for the shift. Not really. Just the usual, probably catching up on some reading. Maybe binge watching something mindless. I paused, then added, You? He shrugged, a small grin playing at his lips. Pretty much the same, though I might throw in a hike or two if the weather's good. Clears my mind. I'll bet, I replied, nodding. I can see how that would be relaxing. I always think about taking up hiking, but then I remember I'm allergic to nature, I joked, earning a laugh from him. Hey, I'll get you out there one day, he said, his tone half teasing, half serious. Maybe you just need the right guide. We both laughed, the tension easing, yet beneath it, I could still feel the electricity simmering between us, the potential for something more. And though I knew better, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to follow that spark, to let it take me somewhere unexpected. As the afternoon wore on, neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. We lingered, sharing stories and jokes, our conversation weaving in and out of light-hearted banter and deeper, more meaningful exchanges. It felt as though we were suspended in a little bubble, separate from the rest of the world, and I found myself savoring every moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, we finished our coffee, the empty cups serving as a quiet reminder that our time together would have to end, at least for now. Adam glanced at his watch, sighing reluctantly. I should probably get going. I've got a few things I need to take care of before the weekend. Yeah, me too, I replied, trying to mask the disappointment in my voice. But this was nice. Really nice? He nodded, his gaze lingering on me. It was. We should do this again sometime. I hesitated, the rational part of me screaming to step back, to keep this as nothing more than a casual coffee date, but I couldn't resist the pull I felt toward him. The way he made me feel understood and appreciated in a way that had become all too rare in my life. Yeah, I said finally, offering a small, tentative smile. I'd like that. He stood, and I followed suit, gathering my things as we made our way to the door. We walked outside together, the cool air brushing against my cheeks as I looked up at the sky, now painted in soft shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. As we reached the corner where we'd have to part ways, Adam turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Hey, if you ever need anything, or just want to talk, you can reach out, right? I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat at the sincerity in his words. I know. And thank you, Adam. Really. For a moment, we just stood there, both of us caught in the strange, magnetic pull that had woven itself between us. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the small distance separating us, but I held back, unsure of where this would lead if I allowed myself to cross that line. Finally, he offered a small, warm smile, his eyes filled with a gentle understanding. Take care, all right? You too, I whispered, watching as he turned and walked away, his figure gradually blending into the crowd as he disappeared from view. I stood there for a few moments longer, feeling the weight of his absence settle over me, mingling with the lingering warmth of our time together. As I turned and began to walk back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something monumental, something that had the power to change everything. I knew, deep down, that I was playing with fire, inching closer and closer to a line I'd never thought I'd cross. But as I walked, the memory of Adam's words and the way he'd looked at me lingered, filling me with a quiet thrill that I couldn't quite bring myself to regret. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of excitement, a sense of possibility that stretched out before me like an uncharted path, waiting to be explored. The moment our coffee date ended, something shifted within me. I knew I was past the point of pretending this was just a friendly connection. Adam and I had begun something, and while I hadn't defined it or spoken the truth out loud, I felt it pulse between us like a live wire. The emotional connection was deepening, and with each passing day, I found myself reaching for my phone to message him, aching to hear his thoughts on even the smallest things. What started as a spark had transformed into an undeniable current, pulling me closer to him with every glance, every message, every shared laugh. In the days that followed, I could sense Daniel growing distant again, though he was physically home more often. The awkward silences between us had become heavier, filled with unspoken tension, and I wasn't sure if it was because he sensed something had changed or if it was simply a byproduct of my own guilt. I tried to be present, to engage him in conversation, and find common ground, but each attempt felt stilted, as though we were playing parts in a script we no longer believed in. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room scrolling through a series of texts from Adam, I caught myself smiling, truly smiling, in a way that had become rare. He had been sharing funny stories about his day, trivial little details that had somehow brightened my evening more than Daniel's presence in the next room. I felt a pang of guilt but quickly brushed it aside, letting myself savor the fleeting happiness Adam brought into my life. It was during one of these exchanges that Adam suggested meeting again, this time a little further outside the city, where we'd have more privacy. The suggestion sent a thrill through me, mingled with an anxious tension I couldn't ignore. We agreed to meet that Friday afternoon at a secluded park by the river, a spot neither of us had been before, but both knew was beautiful and, most importantly, quiet. The day arrived and I dressed carefully, trying not to read too much into my choice of outfit, but unable to help myself. I wanted to look good for him, to feel that spark I'd begun craving. The drive to the park felt surreal, as though I was traveling toward a life I'd only ever imagined in my daydreams. The weight of my decisions loomed over me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind, too focused on the anticipation building inside me. When I arrived, Adam was already there, leaning against his car with his hands in his pockets, looking relaxed and perfectly at ease. His face broke into a warm smile as soon as he saw me, and in that moment, all my doubts and anxieties melted away. "Hey," he greeted, his voice filled with that familiar warmth that instantly put me at ease. "I'm glad you made it." "Me too," I replied, returning his smile. We fell into step together, walking along the winding path that led through the trees and down toward the riverbank. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves creating a peaceful backdrop that felt like a world away from reality. For a while we walked in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's presence, letting the quiet settle over us like a comforting blanket. When we reached a small clearing near the river, Adam stopped, gesturing toward a fallen log where we could sit. We settled onto the rough bark, sitting close enough that our knees brushed, a small, innocent touch that sent a ripple of warmth through me. "This place is beautiful," I murmured, taking in the view of the water glistening in the afternoon sun, the gentle ripples catching the light. "It is," he agreed, though his gaze was fixed on me rather than the scenery. "I'm glad we're here together." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, I felt a rush of vulnerability, as though he could see right through me. But instead of shying away, I found myself meeting his gaze, letting the warmth in his eyes settle over me, wrapping me in a sense of safety and understanding I hadn't felt in so long. "Adam," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "do you ever wonder if we're making a mistake?" He considered my question, his expression thoughtful, yet without a hint of doubt or hesitation. "Honestly, I don't know, but I do know that whatever this is, it feels right. It feels like we're meant to be here in this moment." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with a truth I'd been afraid to acknowledge. I knew it wasn't rational, that we were treading a dangerous path. But there was a sense of inevitability to it all, as though the choices I'd made had been leading me to this very point, to this connection that felt as real and essential as the air I breathed. Without thinking, I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his, feeling the strength, and warmth of his touch steadying me. He looked down at our intertwined hands, a small smile playing on his lips, and I could feel the intensity of his emotions radiating through that simple contact. As we sat there, lost in our private world, the sounds of the river and the forest around us faded into the background. The space between us seemed to shrink, as though an invisible thread was pulling us closer. I could feel my heart pounding, my pulse racing, each beat bringing me closer to a choice I couldn't turn away from. Slowly, Adam lifted his free hand to my face, his fingers grazing my cheek with a gentleness that made my breath catch. His touch was warm, grounding, and in that moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a certainty that, right or wrong, this was what I wanted, what I needed. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a question there, a silent plea for permission, for confirmation. Without a word, I closed the space between us, my lips meeting his in a soft, tentative kiss that quickly deepened, fueled by a longing that had been building for far too long. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrendering to the moment, to the rush of emotions that surged within me. The kiss was both exhilarating and terrifying, a mix of passion and tenderness that left me breathless. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was fully present, fully alive, every sense heightened, every nerve tingling with the thrill of connection. When we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine, I could feel the rapid beat of his heart, matching my own. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern and a hint of vulnerability. I nodded, a shaky smile spreading across my face. "Yeah, I'm more than okay." He pulled me into an embrace, his arms wrapping around me in a way that felt protective, grounding. We sat there in silence, holding each other, both of us fully aware of the gravity of what had just happened, yet unwilling to let go. In that moment, all my doubts and fears faded, replaced by a profound sense of peace, as though I'd finally found the place where I belonged. As the afternoon wore on, we continued to talk, our conversation drifting between laughter and quiet reflection, sharing memories and dreams, fears and hopes. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone else, revealing parts of myself that had remained hidden, even from Daniel. With Adam, I felt seen, understood, cherished in a way that transcended words. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I knew it was time to leave, yet a part of me resisted, clinging to the precious moments we'd shared. But as we walked back to our cars, hand in hand, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet assurance that whatever happened next, this connection would remain, a part of me that I would carry forward. At the car, we paused, neither of us willing to say goodbye. He brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering, and I could see the same mix of emotions mirrored in his eyes. "I'll see you soon," he asked, his tone hopeful, yet tinged with uncertainty. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "I want this. I want you." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, and he leaned down, pressing one last, lingering kiss to my lips. When he pulled back, he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart ache, a silent promise that echoed the commitment I felt in my own heart. As I drove home, the memory of his touch, his words, lingered like a warm glow, filling me with a quiet joy, a sense of completeness I hadn't felt in years. I knew the path we were on was risky, that the choices I was making would come with consequences, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that I had found something real, something undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The days following my time with Adam were filled with an undeniable sense of change. I floated through each day in a state of heightened awareness, every memory of our time together casting a warm glow over my routine, filling me with a quiet thrill that I hadn't felt in years. When I looked in the mirror, I could see the difference in my own eyes, a spark that had been missing, a lightness that I hadn't noticed slipping away until it had returned. I felt alive again, as though a part of me had been unlocked, set free. But as the days passed, my mind couldn't entirely silence the guilt that crept in during the quiet moments. Every time I spoke to Daniel, I felt a pang of remorse, a reminder of the man I'd once chosen to build a life with. Our conversations were still stilted, the distance between us as vast as ever, but now I was hyper-aware of it. I was carrying a secret, and that secret was growing heavier with each passing day. And yet, despite the guilt, I couldn't stop myself from reaching out to Adam, finding comfort in his presence, feeling understood in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. Our stolen moments, the quiet texts, the late-night phone calls, each interaction only deepened the connection between us, weaving our lives together in ways I hadn't anticipated. One evening, as I was finishing up with some work emails in the dim light of my office, my phone lit up with a message from him. "Can you meet tonight? I need to see you." The simplicity of his words sent a shiver through me, a thrill that I'd come to recognize, a feeling that had become addictively familiar. Without a second thought, I replied, "Yes, where?" We agreed to meet at a small, secluded inn on the edge of town, a place we knew would offer the privacy we needed. I felt a pang of nerves as I made my way there, the weight of what we were doing pressing down on me. This wasn't a casual coffee date or a walk in the park. This was a deliberate choice, a step across a line that we both knew couldn't be undone. And yet I felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force drawing me toward him, making it impossible to turn back. When I arrived, I found him waiting just outside the entrance, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze focused on the ground as he paced. When he looked up and saw me, his face broke into a smile, and in that instant, all my doubts faded. I was where I wanted to be, where I needed to be. "Hey," he greeted, his voice soft, tinged with a mix of relief and anticipation. "I didn't know if you'd come." "I'm here," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. There was so much I wanted to say, but I couldn't find the words. All I knew was that being with him felt right, that I was drawn to him in a way that defied logic or reason. We walked into the inn together, our steps falling in sync as we made our way down a quiet hallway. The room was simple, understated: a bed, a small seating area, a dim lamp casting a warm glow over everything. As the door clicked shut behind us, a tension settled over the room, thick and electric, charging the air between us. Adam took a step closer, his gaze steady as he searched my face, as though seeking permission, reassurance. His hand reached up, his fingers grazing my cheek, a soft, tentative touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur, filled with both vulnerability and restraint. "Yes," I whispered, my heart pounding as I met his gaze, feeling a sense of certainty that eclipsed everything else. I wanted this. I wanted him. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, a slow, deliberate exploration that quickly deepened, fueled by the months of suppressed desire, the nights spent yearning, the stolen moments and the unspoken promises. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the connection that had taken root between us, blossoming in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. The world outside faded, all my worries and doubts dissolving as we moved together, our shared breath, our whispered words, the soft murmurs of our names creating a symphony that filled the space between us. Every touch, every kiss felt like an affirmation, a reminder of the connection we shared, a bond that went beyond the physical, binding us in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. When we finally lay together, tangled in each other's arms, a quiet contentment settled over us, a sense of peace that felt both fragile and profound. Adam's hand traced gentle circles along my back, his touch soothing, grounding. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his voice soft, laced with a hint of vulnerability. I looked up at him, my heart swelling at the sincerity in his eyes. "Me neither," I replied, feeling the weight of my own words, the truth of them settling over me like a revelation. But even as we lay there, a part of me knew that what we were building was built on borrowed time. The reality of our choices hung heavy, a shadow that loomed over us, reminding me that this happiness, this feeling of being truly seen, was temporary, fleeting, and yet, in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. We stayed together late into the night, sharing whispered dreams and stolen kisses, creating a world that belonged to just the two of us. He told me stories of his childhood, of the dreams he'd once had, the things he'd lost along the way, and I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone else, sharing parts of myself that I'd kept hidden, even from Daniel. With Adam, I felt safe, understood, cherished in a way that transcended words. But as dawn approached, reality began to creep back in, a reminder that the world we'd created was a fragile illusion, one that couldn't exist outside the walls of that room. As we dressed in silence, an unspoken sadness hung between us, a shared understanding that what we'd built was both beautiful and impossible. When we stepped outside, the early morning air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of finality that settled heavy in my chest. Adam reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, grounding me, holding me close in the quiet moments before we'd have to part. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, though I could feel the weight of our decision pressing down on me. "I don't know how, but yes. I don't want to lose this." He nodded, his grip tightening around my hand, as though anchoring himself in the promise we'd made, however tenuous it was. "Neither do I." We stood there in silence, our hands intertwined, our gazes locked, both of us aware that the choice we'd made carried consequences we couldn't fully comprehend. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the connection we shared, the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel whole in a way I hadn't felt in years. As we finally said goodbye, our hands lingering in each other's grasp until the last possible second, I felt a sense of both loss and hope, a strange mix of emotions that left me feeling both exhilarated and empty. The drive home was a blur, the quiet streets passing by in a haze as I replayed the night in my mind, the feel of his touch, the sound of his laughter, the quiet murmur of his voice. I knew what I was doing was dangerous, that I was playing with fire, edging closer to a line I couldn't uncross. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. When I arrived home, the house was silent, bathed in the soft, early morning light. I made my way to the bedroom, slipping quietly into bed beside Daniel, who was still fast asleep, oblivious to the life I was building outside our marriage. I lay there, my mind swirling with memories of the night, the warmth of Adam's embrace, the feel of his lips on mine. I knew that this path was fraught with risk, that the choices I was making would have consequences. But as I lay there, the weight of the secret pressing down on me, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet certainty, that for the first time in a long time I was living a life that felt true to myself. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not when I'd finally found something that made me feel alive. The next few weeks were a delicate balancing act, each day a complicated dance as I navigated the lines I'd drawn between my life with Daniel and the hidden world I was building with Adam. Every morning, I'd wake up to the reality of my choices, feeling the weight of the secret I carried like a stone in my chest. And yet, as much as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Each time Adam and I parted, there was a pang of loss, a hunger that lingered long after I returned to my daily routine. I found myself craving the moments we shared, the stolen glances, the late-night texts, the way he made me feel alive and seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Living with this secret turned my life into a series of contrasts. At home, I was the dutiful wife, following the routines Daniel and I had fallen into over the years. Our conversations were as polite and sparse as ever, mostly revolving around household responsibilities, schedules, and the occasional plan for dinner with friends. I went through the motions, trying to keep up the facade, but inside, I was worlds away, my mind constantly drifting to thoughts of Adam, to the life I was creating in the shadows. One evening, as Daniel and I sat in the living room, watching a show, I found myself studying his face, the lines of his jaw, the way he absently sipped his drink without really tasting it. The familiarity of his presence, the quiet ease that once felt comforting, now felt like a cage, a reminder of the life I'd chosen and the happiness I was beginning to question. Guilt rose within me as I wondered what he would think, how he would feel if he knew where my heart was. But each time the guilt threatened to overwhelm me, I'd find myself back in Adam's arms, letting the world fall away, giving in to the intoxicating connection we shared. He became my sanctuary, the place I could escape to when everything else felt hollow and gray. We would meet in secret, our conversations filled with laughter and shared dreams, our touches laced with the passion we'd both been missing. With him, I felt free, alive in a way that made the rest of my life feel like an echo. Yet, the double life was taking its toll. The tension of maintaining appearances, of keeping up the lie, was exhausting. I found myself constantly checking my phone, worrying over every message, every call, afraid that Daniel might accidentally discover the truth. I became more cautious, deleting messages, making excuses, even creating fake errands to slip away and meet Adam. The lengths I was going to keep the secret intact felt like a betrayal, not just to Daniel, but to myself. It wasn't long before Daniel started to notice the changes. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for a supposed book club meeting I'd invented on a whim, he watched me with a strange look, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my outfit, the way I'd done my makeup. "Book club, huh?" he asked, his tone light but laced with suspicion. "Yes," I replied, forcing a smile as I adjusted my scarf. "We're reading a new novel, and the group's been getting together more regularly." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "You've been going out a lot lately. It's just not like you." My stomach tightened, the anxiety bubbling up as I tried to play it off. "Just trying to keep busy," I said with a shrug, avoiding his gaze. "Sometimes it's nice to have something to look forward to, you know?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and I felt the weight of his scrutiny, the unspoken questions that hung between us. "I guess so," he murmured, his tone softer. "Just don't stay out too late, okay?" I nodded, feeling the tension ease slightly as he turned away, but a part of me couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that he was beginning to suspect something. Each time I left the house, I could feel his eyes on me, his quiet concern growing into something more pointed, a silent question I didn't want to face. As my relationship with Adam deepened, the web of lies I'd spun grew more complex. I could see the worry etched into Daniel's face each time I left, the way he'd linger in the doorway, watching me with a mix of sadness and confusion. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything was fine, but I knew the words would be hollow. My heart was elsewhere, my thoughts consumed by Adam, by the life I was building in secret. It all came to a head one evening when I returned home late, after a particularly intense night with Adam. I'd lost track of time, wrapped up in the warmth of his arms, the way he made me feel cherished, understood. By the time I arrived home, it was well past midnight, the house dark and silent as I slipped through the door, my heart pounding as I tried to move quietly. But as I entered the living room, I froze. Daniel was sitting in the armchair, his gaze fixed on me, his face shadowed in the dim light. There was an intensity in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a look that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're late," he said, his voice low, laced with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Hurt, anger, suspicion. I couldn't tell, but the weight of it settled over me, heavy and inescapable. "Sorry," I replied, forcing a casual tone as I set my bag down, trying to steady my voice. "Lost track of time." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze piercing, and I felt the lie hanging between us, thick and suffocating. "You've been doing that a lot lately," he said quietly, his words hitting me like a punch. "Losing track of time, going out, making excuses." A cold fear settled over me, and I forced myself to look at him, to keep up the charade, even as my heart hammered in my chest. "It's just book club, Daniel. I don't know what you're implying." But he didn't relent. "Are you happy, really? Because lately, it doesn't feel like we're even in the same life anymore." His words cut through me, a painful reminder of the distance I'd created, the gap I'd widened with every lie, every secret. I felt the sting of guilt, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, suffocating in their intensity. "I'm fine," I replied, the lie slipping out before I could stop it. "Just need some space, that's all." He nodded, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the silent resignation, as he accepted my hollow reassurance, as though he knew it was a lie but couldn't bear to confront the truth. And as he turned away, disappearing down the hall without another word, I felt a wave of despair wash over me, a sense of loss that left me hollow and aching. The following days were tense, filled with an unspoken tension that lingered in every conversation, every glance. Daniel's suspicion grew, his gaze more searching, his questions more pointed, as though he was waiting for me to slip, to confirm the doubts he didn't dare voice. And in those quiet moments, when the weight of my choices pressed down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it, if the happiness I'd found with Adam could truly justify the pain I was causing, the life I was unraveling. Yet, despite the guilt, despite the toll it was taking on my life, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Adam had become my escape, my sanctuary, the one person who made me feel alive, seen, cherished. With him, I was free from the weight of my responsibilities, the expectations, the routine that had begun to feel like a prison. But as I stood at the edge of this double life, staring into the abyss of the choices I'd made, I felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that I couldn't ignore. I was walking a dangerous path, a line that was becoming harder and harder to navigate, and I knew that sooner or later, the life I'd built in secret would come crashing down, leaving me to face the wreckage of everything I'd left behind. The tension at home had reached an unbearable peak. Every interaction with Daniel felt like walking on glass, each word carefully chosen, each look weighted with suspicion and questions I knew he was too hurt to ask. I could see the change in him, a heaviness in his gaze, a quiet resignation that left me feeling hollow. Yet, the thought of ending things with Adam felt impossible. Adam had become my solace, my joy, my escape from the life that now felt more like a trap than a home. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Daniel came into the kitchen, his expression somber, his movements tense. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching me, and I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his silence pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even, a quiet calm that sent a shiver down my spine. "We need to talk." I froze, a knife in my hand, my heart racing as I turned to face him. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but I could sense the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. I nodded, setting the knife down, bracing myself for what was to come. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know about him." The world seemed to tilt beneath me, my heart pounding, as I struggled to process his words, the shock and fear crashing over me like a tidal wave. "Daniel, Don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp, laced with a pain that cut me to the core. "I don't want your excuses, your lies. I've seen the texts, the calls. I know you've been meeting him, that you've been sneaking around." I felt the blood drain from my face, my chest tightening as the truth hung heavy between us, undeniable and inescapable. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the guilt and regret that now consumed me. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head as he ran a hand through his hair. "How long, huh? How long have you been lying to me? To us?" "Daniel," I whispered, my voice breaking as I struggled to find the words. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. I felt so alone." "Alone?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief, his eyes flashing with anger. "I've been here every day working for us, for this life, and all this time you were with him." The pain in his voice was unbearable, a raw, open wound that made me realize the depth of the betrayal I'd committed. I wanted to reach out to him, to apologize, to somehow make him understand, but I knew it was futile. There was nothing I could say that would undo the damage, nothing that would heal the hurt I'd caused. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling empty, hollow, inadequate. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I I was just so unhappy, and he made me feel alive again. He looked away, his jaw clenched, his shoulders tense as he struggled to contain his emotions. Alive. That's what this was about. Feeling alive. He shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. What about Miha? What about us? Did none of that matter? The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with the weight of all the things we'd left unsaid, all the moments we'd let slip away. I could feel the walls closing in, the life I'd built crumbling around me, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my own choices, my own mistakes. Was he worth it? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on me with a cold intensity that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. Was he really worth destroying everything we had? I swallowed, my throat tight as I struggled to answer, to find the truth in the mess of emotions swirling within me. I don't know, I admitted, my voice shaking as I faced the reality of my choices. I don't know if he was worth it. All I know is that I was so lost. I didn't know how to fix us, and I felt like I was drowning. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound filled with hurt, with disbelief. So you decided to find a lifeline in someone else. Instead of coming to me, instead of trying to save what we had, you just turned away. The words hit me like a slap, a painful reminder of the choices I'd made, the path I'd taken that had led us to this moment. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it hadn't been that simple, that I'd felt trapped and unseen, but I knew it would be futile. The truth was, I'd chosen the easy way out, the path that had offered an escape, a reprieve from the emptiness I'd felt. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice choked with tears. I know that doesn't fix anything, that it doesn't make up for what I've done, but I am sorry. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his gaze filled with a mix of sadness and disappointment that made my heart ache. Finally, he took a step back, his shoulders slumping, as though the weight of everything had finally become too much. I need some time, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. To think, to figure out what comes next. I nodded, tears streaming down my face as I watched him turn and walk away, disappearing down the hall, leaving me standing alone in the empty kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life we'd built together. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the echoes of all the things I'd lost, all the choices I'd made that had led me to this point. As I stood there, the reality of my actions settled over me, a suffocating weight that left me feeling hollow, empty. I'd sacrificed everything, my marriage, my happiness, my sense of self, all for a fleeting escape, a momentary reprieve that had ultimately led to ruin. In the days that followed, the house felt like a ghost of its former self, filled with a silence that echoed with memories, with regrets. Daniel and I barely spoke, our interactions reduced to strained pleasantries, a fragile truce that offered no comfort, no solace. I spent most of my days alone, haunted by the choices I'd made, the life I'd destroyed. I wanted to reach out to Adam, to find some semblance of comfort, but I knew it would be selfish, that clinging to him would only deepen the wounds I'd inflicted on myself and those around me. I'd built my happiness on a foundation of lies, and now I was left to face the consequences, to confront the truth I'd tried so hard to escape. One evening, as I sat alone in the empty living room, I received a message from Adam, a simple line that made my heart ache. Are you okay? For a moment, I considered responding, reaching out to him, seeking solace in the one person who'd made me feel alive. But as I stared at the screen, I realized that I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the truth. I needed to face the wreckage I'd created, to find a way to rebuild, even if it meant letting go of the one thing that had given me joy. Taking a deep breath, I typed a response, my fingers shaking, as I forced myself to press send. I can't do this anymore. I need to figure things out on my own. His reply came quickly, a simple "I understand," but I could feel the weight of his words, the quiet acceptance that mirrored my own. And as I set the phone aside, a sense of finality settled over me, a painful clarity that left me feeling both shattered and strangely at peace. I didn't know what the future held, or if I'd ever find a way to rebuild the life I'd torn apart. But as I sat in the silence, surrounded by the remnants of my choices, I felt a quiet resolve, a determination to face the consequences, to confront the pain I'd caused and find a way forward, however uncertain it might be. And though the path ahead was unclear, I knew one thing for certain: I could no longer hide from the truth. It was time to face the reckoning, to confront the person I'd become and find a way to make peace with the choices I'd made, however painful the journey might be.